When the ambulance doors swung open outside the Now Center morgue on November the 28th, 1934, the men waiting on the inside for that body had no idea what was about to roll out at them. Wrapped in a cheap, mud-stained Native American patterned blanket was the body of Lester Gillis. The world knew him by another name, though, Babyface Nelson. Just 24 hours earlier, on November the 27th, 1934, he had been J. Edgar Hoover's undisputed public enemy number one, and now he is just a pile of meat on a steel table. The team at the Sadowski Funeral Home in Chicago was the crew who had to deal with the gory aftermath of his 17 bullet wounds. I'm Mr. V, and welcome back to The Hidden Lens. Today we're going behind the scenes of one of the gnarliest embalming jobs in the 1930s. What it actually took to put Babyface Nelson back together again after the FBI had taken him apart. You know, he had a face that only a mama could love, right? So they got some work to do to put him back together. Now, preparing Babyface Nelson's body was a stomach-turning nightmare that tested the limits of the 20th century embalming. Nelson hadn't just been shot. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had turned him into a human sieve. To get a feel of what this mortician was up against, you got to know what those 17 bullets actually did to him during that final shootout with the FBI. They called it the Battle of Barrington. FBI agent Herman Hollis was working with a heavy-duty shotgun that day. He sent a blast of large-caliber buckshot right to Nelson's lower half. A bunch of shotgun pellets ripped through his legs. By the time those pellets were done working, his thighs were nothing but jagged, open lacerations. But the shot that actually ended his life came from a Thompson submachine gun. That heavy, high-velocity bullet, well, maybe not as high velocity as what we've got nowadays, but it was good then, 45 caliber, I do believe. Well, that bullet had torn clean through Nelson's abdomen. It obliterated his internal organs, which they do that at 45 caliber, and severed major blood vessels along the way. That happens too when you get hit with one. Now, here's the thing. He didn't die right then and there, which is unfortunate. Nelson's legendary rage kept him on his feet long enough to kill both federal lawmen. Then John Paul Chase hauled him into the getaway car. Chase had been riding with the gang. As Chase sped off, Nelson spent his final hours slowly bleeding out internally in a safe house. His wife, Helen Gillis, was right there with him, watching him wither away. After he had took his last breath, Chase and Helen did the right thing. They stripped him completely naked to destroy any forensic evidence on his clothing, which is, he needed that. Then we left the mortician staring at every one of those wounds without anything to soften the blow, you know? So, now you know what else is on borrowed time? The hype button. Down below in the comments line. Go ahead and give it a click before it disappears, and take a swipe at that subscribe button while you're down there so you don't miss the next episode. Now, all that damage created a mechanical crisis inside the Sadowski Funeral Home. Here's how embalming is supposed to work. You pump chemical preservations into the arterial system, and the body's own blood vessels distribute the fluid everywhere it needs to go. The leftover blood just drains through the veins. It's simple. It's a simple principle of physics. And it all depends on the circulatory system holding pressure like a garden hose. But Babyface Nelson's garden hose, his circulatory system, was completely demolished. He had 17 open wounds, puncturing his skin and his muscles. A submachine gun bullet that shredded his abdominal arteries. The body couldn't hold pressure. The undertaker hooked up the embalming machine. He started pumping formaldehyde into the cardiac artery, and the fluid didn't circulate. Instead, the fluid found the path of least resistance. Just like deer do when they're in the woods. They're going to go with the path of least resistance. So's his blood. It went geysering back out of all 17 of those bullet wounds across the torso and the legs. So the mortician had to play a slow, gross game of hide and seek. He had to use metal tools to dig into the cold, torn flesh of every single wound. The broken blood vessels in there had to be found and tied shut with tight knots of string. Then you had this massive hole in the belly that the Thompson machine gun had left behind. He used big needles to stitch through the deep muscles and stitched them together to plug the gap. Now the leg wounds were saturated with jagged shotgun pellets, and those required dozens of individual clamps. Hell, you feel like you're in a beauty parlor and somebody's putting curlers in your hair with all that stuff going on, right? But they're doing it all over his body. Well, the workspace was incredibly messy, as you would think it would be. You had old dark blood mixed with the sharp, eye-watering fumes of early generation formaldehyde. And all of that was happening in a very small, poorly ventilated basement room. But the bullet holes weren't the only thing the mortician had to contend with. He also had to deal with Chase and Helen had done to the body after he was dead. This is the good part. Chase and Helen were desperate to escape the rapidly tightening dragnet. They drove his naked body out to the edge of a cemetery and dumped him in a muddy, freezing ditch. By the time the police found him, the cold air had caused advanced post-mortem lividity. What that means is his blood had pooled violently in the lower portions of his body and left behind deep purple discolorations that wouldn't go away. And his bare skin was caked in hard mud and dry blood from the road. Before he could even start the real embalming work, the mortician had a serious scrubbing job ahead of him. Soap and stiff brushes were the tools just to wash off the ditch water and find some clean skin underneath. Then came the inside cleaning. It's like Roto-Rooter all over again, but worse. Nelson had spent hours bleeding into his own belly. The cavity inside was full of old, trapped blood. Blood sitting inside a warm body for hours will rot fast and start to smell terrible. That's how come that roadkill smells the way it does. To fix this, the mortician used a tool called a Trocar. Here's a picture of it. It's basically a long, sharp metal rod attached to a surgical pump. He had to forcefully plunge that metal spike into Nelson's stomach. I bet he didn't feel a thing, though, because he was dead. Then he moved it back and forth to punch holes in the organs, because he was dead. That let the pump drain out pounds of rotten blood and other fluids. Couldn't have that body bloating up now, could you? Once the cavity was hollowed out, he poured highly concentrated cavity-cleaning chemicals right into the torso to dry everything out from the inside. The mortician had to do this delicate, gruesome surgery in the middle of pure, unadulterated chaos. The Sadowski Funeral Home was a fortress under siege. Earlier that year, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had suffered an embarrassing failure to capture the gang at Little Bohemia Lodge Raid. The gang got away. Ever since then, J. Edgar Hoover had been observed being obsessed and trying to destroy these outlaws. Famous FBI agent Melvin Purvis had already gunned down John Dillinger outside the Biograph Theater that summer, so Nelson was the top target that was then left alive. Now, that Nelson was dead, though. Hoover's armed agent stood directly over their embalming table watching the mortician's every move because they didn't have anybody else to go get. They forced the undertaker to stop working so they could press ink onto Nelson's cold, dead fingers for identification cards. After that came the bright flash of photos of his face and every single bullet wound for the official files in the trophy room. Outside the room, the scenes were just as intense. The moment the public found out babyface Nelson was inside, thousands of morbidly curious people swarmed the streets. They pushed against the windows just to see the dead monster. Police had to form a human wall to keep the rowdy crowd from rushing the doors or breaking the glass. Finally came the restorative art. Nelson's family wanted a private burial. The undertaker had to make that boyish face look presentable for his mama. His face wasn't hit by bullets, but the pain of his death had left him looking pale and hollow. The mortician injected special liquids under the skin of his cheeks to plump them back up. I think people pay for that now, don't they? What's it called? Botox? Yeah. So the Morticians are doing that Botox thing to Nelson. That brought back the young look that gave him his nickname in the first place. He closed the eyelids and wired the jaw shut from inside so the mouth wouldn't drop open. Then, to go along with this beauty treatment of Botox, the Mortician applied some heavy makeup to make him look like he's not as dead. You know, they gotta cover up that pale skin to hide all the colors of death. When the Mortician finally finished all that, he dressed his gangster up in a clean suit. I'm sure Nelson probably looked like a painted up clown by that time, or at least not as dead. But the circus was far from over. When the body was moved into the chapel, the actual funeral service had to be kept under lock and key. Nelson's mama and his close relatives wanted a quiet, traditional Catholic service. They locked the doors to the public. Only a small handful of family members were allowed inside. Because his face had been repaired so well, he looked peaceful in his plain casket, which completely hid the violent way he died. Ain't that a crock? The biggest thing missing from that funeral was his wife, Helen Gillis. The FBI caught her just a few days before the service. While her husband was being prayed over, she was locked away in a federal holding cell, completely unavailable to say an official last goodbye. But I'm sure she had a few choice words over his dead body when she threw his ass in the ditch not too long before, don't you think? When the short service ended, the family had to sneak the casket out of the back door of the funeral home. Outside on the pavement, swarming reporters and photographers were waiting to catch a glimpse. A small line of cars drove out to St. Joseph Catholic Cemetery in River Grove, Illinois. There were no grand speeches or gangster tributes. He was quickly lowered into a regular family plot alongside his blessed relatives. To this day, he rests under a simple stone that reads, Lester G. Gillis. Not a single mention to the name Babyface Nelson. To the public, he is a movie villain who went down fighting in a blaze of glory. But to the tired morticians who spent hours covered in his blood, plugging 17 holes in a ruined body and hiding all that damage from a grieving mama, he was nothing more than an unforgettable, grotesque mess of a workday. Now, if this one stuck with you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment below to let me know which other public enemy story you want me to take apart next. I'm Mr. V, and I'll see you in the next episode of The Hidden Lens.